Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Justle podcast. I'm Ernie Raposa, a technologist, career coach, and moonlighting as a podcaster. And I have a great panel here today to talk about quiet quitting, burnout, work-life balance. It's all in the news, and we have folks here to see how folks like yourself can adapt in this crazy world and bring your best self to work in life. So let me introduce the panel here, starting with Ali Glazer. Ali is an executive performance coach and leadership development specialist focused on one-on-one coaching and team training. She's based in Central New Jersey. Welcome, Ali.
Hi, Ernie. Glad to be back.
Glad to have you. Ted Turk is a business coach and strategist. He specializes in helping small business owners uncover thousands of hidden profits, hundreds of thousands of hidden profits without spending additional money on advertising. And as a bonus, reconnect to their why. Ted is based in Atlanta. Welcome, Ted. All right. And Karen Wollenbring, a new podcast member, welcome to our pod, Karen, is an integrative medicine physician who practices in Erie, Pennsylvania. And one of her special interests and focus is addressing stress and burnout in healthcare workers through a combination of integrative medicine and coaching. And Karen, I think this is up to the minute news here, late breaking news that you just completed your CTI training and are about to start your CTI certification journey. So congrats and welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.
All right. And last but not least, Jim Wollenbring is a strategy and business consultant and leadership coach focused on healthcare, data analytics, leadership development, and life career coaching. Jim is based out of St. Paul, Minnesota. Welcome, Jim.
Hi, everybody.
And you may have heard that there are two folks with the same last names here. This is a brother-sister dynamic duo joining us today, so I expect to fully enjoy that and have fun with that dynamic today. All right, so let's get into this, folks. So quiet quitting is in the news. It's some people say it's always been a thing, and we just came up with a new buzzword for it. At a high level, it's kind of disengagement. But let's talk about this. Let's throw around the definition, and I'm going to start with Ted. What is that? How is that showing up for you and your clients, and what does that mean for you?
As we were getting ready to do this, I kind of went to, I was doing some research and I heard in a podcast, and wish I could remember who said this, but they went to knowyourmemes.com to figure out what is this thing, right?
Yeah.
So quiet quitting is kind of a slang term that really describes people who are doing their job and not going above and beyond. And the fact is, in my client base, maybe they're self-selected. I'm not seeing this. I'm going to say that I don't believe quiet quitting's a thing.
Mm-hmm. You're our outlier. Well, maybe. Yeah. Let's see. Let's see what the rest of the panel says here.
So,
okay, I'm going to go around the room here and move on to Ali. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that what we're doing with this buzzword, quiet quitting, which is cool that it's bringing a lot of important conversation to the forefront. But what I think it's doing is conflating setting boundaries, healthy boundaries between our work life and our personal life, taking good care of ourselves, which is something that in my practice, I've been working with coaches and leaders rather for years doing this work. And conflating it with like people who are just uninspired, calling it in, burnt out, not, just should probably find another job or not work. I think that there's a real issue here. I think the term is just a little bit of clickbait, but I think there's a real issue here that's not new at all. It's about finding that balance or finding the right fit for where your inspiration currently lies.
Great. Thanks, Ali. And Karen.
Yeah, so I kind of agree with what Ali was saying in the sense that, with the definition of, okay, not taking your job too seriously, to not do the extra or go the extra mile. I think what's not being said is a lot of times there's unrealistic expectations at play. And people are then saying, this is almost toxic for me to try and do this extra bit. And so I can't do that. I can't choose that. And so I almost would like to reframe it into choosing realistic expectations instead of quiet quitting. Quitting has a negative connotation, almost like a failure piece, when in fact it's actually choosing more authentically and choosing to not have work be everything in your life.
Right. So it's setting boundaries.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And Jim, I saw that you might have some flaky internet there, but I think I'm good so far.
Yeah, I think I'm good so far right now. So I think I pile on to what kind of Allie and Karen were talking about, but also add, we've all gone through performance essentially reviews, right, in our jobs and such, and and I go back to this meeting expectations, category, right, and that is quiet quitting being, Allie, you used the word conflated with meeting expectations, right? And meeting expectations in a performance review is still an acceptable, fundamental kind of job class or job performance essentially rating that goes with it. So, I think, I'm on the camp of quiet quitting. I think is just an exaggeration, I would say, of the kinds of employees who are essentially drawing boundaries, right? And I'm sure there's going to be a small segment of them who are just really kind of punching the time clock, right? They're checking in, they're really not showing up at all, or very little, right? But that's probably a doesn't meet expectations type of classification if you think about it from a performance perspective. So, I think I would agree with Allie. I think it's clickbait, and I think it's there's a really strong group in that area which is really defining boundaries that are likely probably really, really healthy, for them to be able to do that, to be able to maintain balance and be able to address the other things that are going on in their life.
Right.
Yeah, I think I agree completely that it is clickbait, right? So it's a way to get attention. But there's also two pieces I think we're not really talking about. One is there seems to have a lot of privilege in here. So I don't think my landscaper is quiet quitting. That's not an option. I don't think the person working at the fast food restaurant is quiet quitting. They get fired. So what we're really talking about is people who have been working or have moved to a remote working kind of situation, and coming through the pandemic and all that, we have a society which wasn't designed for it. We're still humans that want to have human contact. We have companies that rushed into this without really having trained their teams and their managers about how to do it. We've got a government that gave so many mixed signals and doesn't work for it. Didn't make it work right. And we've got this system that just doesn't work, isn't working for what we're trying to do. And we're not now trying to blame the last person on the totem pole, the worker.
Yeah.
So there's some really structural problems, and it's not that they're quiet quitting, is that we failed each other in how we've set up.
Wow.
Let me just add one thing to that, Ted. I think it is also a product of our times. There's a phrase that's been out there around employees acting their wage. Not acting their age, but acting their wage, right? And so they're essentially saying, given how much I'm being, what's that?
Somehow that's a negative thing if you're acting your wage, right?
Right. And it's just like, well, given how much I'm being paid for this job and for these responsibilities, they're putting in what they feel, is appropriate for that, for what they're being compensated for, right? So I think it's also another swing back or maybe a backlash, given I think some of the power has been shifting, from employers to employees, given the hot job market and the challenges that employers have, in filling jobs and roles and such. So I don't know if it's a demonization of the worker, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But I would agree with you, Ted. I think there's some privilege in here as well, because I think it only applies to a certain segment of the population of workers out there and people out there. But also I think it's a bit of a backlash, from, I would say, from management and leadership based on some of the challenges that they're running into.
Yeah, and I know we have burnout in our subject list here to talk through, and it's when I look at the progression of before, during, and I wouldn't say we're quite after the pandemic, but the whole past 3 years, burnout was a real thing. And could this quiet quitting just be a manifestation of years and years of just unsustainable expectations, and folks are just checking out because of no other option, right? And I know Karen and Jim, you have a practice you're building focused exclusively on folks that are in that type of situation, and through I'm mangling all of the medical terminology, but to help people get through that period in their life through coaching and integrated medicine, right? So what are you seeing in the practice where folks are experiencing this stress, this burnout, and how that might manifest as quiet quitting, and what you're seeing out there and what you're doing to help people get through that?
So the program that we have going is to really reach out to healthcare workers, physicians, nurses, anyone in healthcare that is overstressed and or at the burnout stage. And so they get to see me in integrative medicine for 6 visits, and then they get 6 coaching visits with Jim. And so in my part of the program, what I'm seeing is that the pandemic certainly has set off, or actually highlighted, the dysfunction that was already there in the system. And so when these workers are burned out, what that is they've just had chronic stress that's been unrelieved over time. And it starts to manifest into physical symptoms of being on overload.
Yeah.
And with burnout, one other way to think about it, outside of just, the exhaustion and not finding meaning in work anymore, not feeling like you're good about what you're doing, all of those types of things are in it. But when burnout really happens is when your time off does not recharge you. That's one of the key pieces. So like you go home at the end of the day, you get up the next day and you're not renewed or recharged, or you go away on the vacation and come back and you're still in that state. There's no recovery piece. So what we're seeing is people in healthcare, the system is broken, and we don't need to go into all the details of that.
Yeah.
But they try to change it, fix it, make some, suggestions, et cetera. And it's often met with no change, and they keep at it. And then at some point, they don't have the energy anymore to try and make change. And so now it's complete survival mode. And when you're in that mode, you can't think of any other options. You're just getting through. So that's the types of folks that we're seeing.
And on the coaching side of things, for those same participants in this program, what they're running into often is a not only a values conflict, but a values betrayal, actually. And because often those values that are promoted and that draw people to healthcare is that care for others, right? That compassion for others, right? And unfortunately, in a number of different situations, not everywhere, but especially with the people that we see in this program, that it's one way. The compassion is from that healthcare provider, that healthcare professional, towards patients, towards others, but they don't feel it coming towards themselves, right? From the organizations, from the places that they work, and so. On a long-term basis, anybody can probably survive a bit of that, on a short-term basis, but you've got decades
in bursts. Yeah.
Correct, right? You've got decades of this that are happening, and so that values betrayal, I would say, contributes significantly to some of the burnout symptoms, because that's an emotional drain, fundamentally. And I think we all operate on the the definition of fulfillment is when you're living your life in alignment with your values, right? It's kind of a classic coaching definition. And I think that's a significant challenge for folks who are suffering burnout.
Yeah. Well, and I know I've had conversations with Allie and Ted around helping job seekers, and we've had a couple of podcasts around identifying what your values are, so that you're not just taking that next job based on title, money, status, whatever, because you may find yourself in this situation of, wow, this does not spark joy, and every Sunday night I'm freaking out. So I think for folks who have come to our site who are in transition or are thinking about that next move, don't put yourself in that situation. And for folks who are in industries where, let's say, these situations tend to happen more frequently, think about, if you have that, let's say, privilege or latitude, think twice before going in, or go in with your eyes open and set boundaries, right? Or if you can.
And one of the things that I have learned to ask since participating, in this program and with these folks has been because I do a lot of values work with these people here. Yeah. And is to ask the question, let's say we discover compassion as a value, right? To ask the question, is that compassion directed to others, or is it also, are you honored, when compassion is directed towards yourself, right? And so that, does it go both ways question, I think, is a really powerful one for coaches actually to ask, because oftentimes it's the cultures and such really push them towards a one-way kind of attitude related to that value, and that's not a full expression of that value, So it's a really challenging situation for them.
A lot of that resonates, and I agree, but there's a little bit we're in my mind still a little bit we're blaming the worker, who is able to fulfill their values, because it is in someone else's economic interest to create an organization which doesn't honor their values. Right. And if we think that we are, as employees, are now more empowered than we were 10 years ago, how do we go about pushing that change? Yeah. It's expensive, right? Because it's going to cost somebody money. They've got a vested interest in the way it's running now.
I think one of the changes that we're seeing and why this is coming to the fore is that the pandemic not only heightened people's mental health issues, but allowed some of that conversation to spill into the workplace in a way that was very taboo in the past. And not that it's still so overwhelmingly accepted to talk about mental health in the workplace, but I do think that there are employers who are beginning to open up those conversation, allow, even for those conversations to be had, HR departments that are providing resources for employees. So it's a little bit more, I think that's where this comes from. That's kind of what I said at the beginning is there's nothing new here. There's a new way of talking about it and a new platform in which to talk about it.
Yeah, I think and maybe there are you can maybe bifurcate this a bit, where you've got the quiet quitting that's attributed to burnout, that is real and valid and requires treatment and conversations and boundaries and value alignment. And then you have the folks who are just like, I'm going to check out and I can get away with this because I'm remote, and that's a real problem, right? So yeah.
Bernie, I totally agree. And it was a point I was going to make when Jim spoke earlier about the performance reviews and like that bell curve. That is not new either. Like look around at your colleagues, your peers, your direct reports. Like there's always going to be people who, are doing what they're supposed to do and good employees, and they're fine. And then there are the, hyper overachievers, right? And then there's the people that probably need to be moving on one way or another. And that's not a new concept either.
dependable, right? It's those people you look at and they're really delivering on it. I want to go back to Ted's comment about kind of where the onus for some of this responsibility lies. And Ted, I am all in on kind of your comment there about, to me, there's a phase in the people we work with on the in this burnout program around self-awareness, right? First, around understanding yourself and understanding kind of where they're at in the present moment, right? Based on the journey that they've gone through and the challenges they've run into. And then a lot of the work that we do is really about boundaries, right? About defining boundaries, setting boundaries. And this gets back to quiet quitting, right? Which is at its essence is defining boundaries, right? It's saying, hey, I'm going to put in this amount of time and effort. And then I'm going to go home and I'm going to focus my attention elsewhere, that piece of it. So, boundary setting, both recognition, setting, and reinforcing those boundaries is a key skill, for people. And again, some have more agency to be able to do that. Others have less agency to do it. But fundamentally, at the end of the day, the ultimate boundary is, do I want to keep working in this job? And is this meeting my needs? And is it time for me to look elsewhere, for a culture that's really more supportive?
I have a question for Karen on the generational aspect of this. When you're out working with folks in healthcare, are you seeing this across the spectrum of, let's say, Boomer, Gen X, Gen Y, Gen Z? Or is it equal opportunity here around where we're seeing this show up?
I would say yes and no. So we're working mainly with people that are, probably in their 40s and above, just from the burnout standpoint. But we also have some exposure to some of the people still in training. We have a med student that's currently working with us, and she's going through this whole traumatizing medical system that creates these, unrealistic expectations. The difference I see is in her generation, she's not just taking it. She's actually doing pushback. She's actually questioning, wait a minute, a 16-hour day and
What's that all about?
6 days a week. Wait a second, and so she's calling into question, and of course getting pushback from the system. So I think there's a little more self-awareness from the people going in, and I would say in the generation behind me, the laws started to change on hours, and so there's a little bit more of, this isn't right for anybody.
Mm-hmm.
So I do think there is a little bit of a generational piece, but I think the burnout is being experienced by those in healthcare longer because they just have taken it for so long and they don't have the reserves anymore. So it's kind of, there is some push for change, but trying to change the system is difficult. And from what Ted said, I think that's hugely important. Burnout will continue unless the system changes. And so, in the beginning, when this whole burnout in healthcare was being focused on, they were really looking at the healthcare workers and basically implying they're not resilient enough. Let's do all these, do a little more meditation and you'll be great, and it's kind of your fault. And
we're gonna bring you lunch.
Yeah, exactly. Here's a nice, thing. And oh, by the way, you can't drink at your job station, but here's a donut. And
you can't go home for 5 weeks or whatever.
Correct. So the first implying was that healthcare workers aren't resilient enough. And in fact, they're probably some of the most resilient people on the planet, just from what they do and their training. Then it kind of swings over to, okay, we need to change the organizational piece. But that just takes so long and people get so discouraged. And then in the meantime, you have all these healthcare workers that are suffering and nothing's being done. And so it's really a recipe for disaster. I don't think people are realizing how desperate it is and how healthcare workers are hanging in there. Mm-hmm. But I don't know for how much longer. And there's a lot of people leaving. And it's so that at some point this has to change. So I think the focus needs to be across the board on helping individuals right now, but also training and also the system itself. And that's a lot to take on.
Yeah, structurally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As of the day that we're recording this, yesterday there was a specific segment on NPR about how healthcare workers had been pushed too far and they were starting to leave. And Ernie, I'll share that with you so we can put it in the show notes.
Yeah, great.
So the idea of quiet quitting, I think is crap, right? So, but the idea of work-life balance, super important, right?
Yeah.
Setting boundaries, super important. And the idea of work-life balance, it's a goal, it's a cycle to it, right? It's not something that's going to happen and stay there. You're gonna have to keep working at it. Sometimes you'll commit a little bit more to work. Sometimes you got to pull back. And that's where good management, expectations, maturity all play a factor.
Absolutely. I think for 2 points to make on that. One is just in response to what Ted just said, and with what Karen's saying about healthcare workers. I think leaders of organizations, it is incumbent upon them to set a culture of healthy workplace boundaries so that we don't have to have a fun hashtag just to say like, hey, time out, we're overworked here, and we don't have any work-life balance. And then once that's this, that takes a long time to build that culture. But I think that then, I don't know if it was just Ted or Jim who were just saying like, you have to work at it. And that's where coaching and working in these programs can also be very helpful.
Yeah.
The other point I want to make is that I think that a piece of this whole motion of quiet quitting is around over identification with our roles, with our jobs, with what we do, and having that define us. And now we're in this, and it's not unlike what Ernie, you were referencing earlier in our earlier conversations about that, how we identify with what our job title is or how much money we're making. And I don't mean that on a practical, I mean over and above what anybody needs to really live comfortably for those who are in roles that are affording them that. But this over identification with our roles, and now part of effective self-care really is not doing that, is just saying, this is just one piece of what I do in my life. It's not, it doesn't define me. It doesn't make me better or worse, or, I like to play tennis, but I also like to, run departments and coach people, right? So there's lots of different things that we want to make sure that we are at it. I just went on a rant.
It was a good rant. It was a good rant.
Just stop at one point, just stop it halfway through.
Okay, you don't want to try a do-over with the last point?
I don't remember what I was saying. I think I said it, and then I just needed to stop.
All right. Well, so I can
put a point on it and pick it up.
So we were talking in a separate coaching session about if we were in an elevator with somebody that we really admired, and the person we were talking with said, well, Michelle Obama, right? You're in an elevator with Michelle Obama and you're just thrilled to be there. And she says, well, what do you do? And do you go to your job? Or do you go to, I'm a mom, I play tennis, I do this, I read novels. And also I have this job where I do this, right? So it was a fun conversation to say, in that elevator ride, who do you say you are? And I know in CTI, we talk about your inner leader and life purpose and all of that stuff. But for folks that haven't been through CTI, that's a hard thing to pull together in that short elevator ride with that person you admire. Right?
Well, first, she asked the wrong question. It's not what do you do? It's what's important to you.
Right.
Tell me about yourself, right?
Totally.
What do you do is what you do for job, people say, right? But
I do podcasts with Justle.
Right. Well, so I'm a big fan of Dan Rockwell. He writes a book called he does a blog called Leadership Freak. And so he has one of his posts recently was about quiet quitting, and he had a couple of tidbits or quiet quitting remedies. And there are a couple on here that really resonate with me. Is one here is break barriers by focusing on the why of work. ask about what the purpose is of what your company does and what is your company most proud of, and develop. The one that really jumped out to me was develop supportive relationships between management and staff, because I feel like in this period of isolation we're in, so many people are suffering alone and in isolation, and they don't feel like they can have those conversations with people in their family who maybe depend on them, or coworkers who they don't want to show vulnerability to. That is just so important for folks to be open and honest with where they are and what they're going through, and that's sometimes a hard divide to cross.
And Ernie, that
That's
brings
the real
up
role of a coach, right? You get to be vulnerable to someone, because you can't tell your staff. And sometimes you don't want to tell your spouse. You can't tell them every time.
Right.
A lot of times your friends or your coworkers or your competition. So where do you go to talk about what the challenges are?
Yeah, and I think Ted, I think in the public kind of forum, I think that brings up the concept of psychological safety, which is one of my kind of favorite topics, right? Which is that ability for people to raise concerns, questions, issues, ideas without feeling like they're going to get made fun of or put down, or that piece of it. And so I think, Ernie, that, I think clearly a coaching relationship is a critical one that's often one-on-one, sometimes small group, settings. But that, I think it's, I think Ali made a point earlier about there's a leadership, I would call it an imperative here, right? For leaders to really help create the space and the environment, right, for their workers, right, the people on their teams to be able to succeed effectively. And some of that is to get some respite, right, to not always push at that high level, back and forth, but also create those spaces for people to be able to do that. So anybody who's listening to this Justle podcast, who's looking for work as a leader, right, in those organizations, I think part of it gets to is asking some really high gain culture questions, right? What is the culture of the organization? And then what kind of impact can you have as a leader within your team? And what kind of autonomy and decision making you have to be able to create that area and that culture and that environment to thrive, right? Because the thriving is the opposite of burnout, right? Thriving is the opposite of quite quitting, and recognize that work is just a piece of it, right?
Right.
And the research really bears out that when we overwork ourselves, whether it's in a day or over a prolonged period of time, we're not as effective. We need those intermittent breaks, whether it's a nice evening at home, and and so I think that's the first most important thing around, like, overworking ourselves just doesn't work, right? It's not effective. And then
diminishing returns.
Yeah. And then I also like to, I say this sort of jokingly, but it's not a joke at all. But how many jobs now, Karen, you're a physician, so you might be one, and you work with healthcare professionals. So in healthcare, yes, there are life and death emergencies every day, all the time. I'm looking at somebody who works in tech, business consultant, coaching, like, there are no life and marketing. There are no marketing emergencies. I'm sorry. And yet we have been brought up to believe that our job is so important. Mm-hmm. So, I say that I work with a team of educators, and I say that, there are no education emergencies. We should all be fine for the next 72 hours. Let's have a great weekend, have a great time off,
Yeah.
So.
Everything you're saying is right on. And from a health perspective, when we are so driven with our, overwork or just the, like you said, the, my goodness, we have to keep at it. And there's that expectation that's there. From a health perspective, that's pushing our autonomic nervous system, into overdrive. And so you get the release of all the stress hormones, and over time that has a very negative impact. And so all the things that you just said of, taking time out and connectivity, doing those things that you enjoy, all that is actually a huge step towards health, because it actually puts the brake on that stress system. And you end up releasing hormones, all those things that actually help you to balance things out. So just from a health perspective, it's key. And when we're working with some of our healthcare workers, it's funny, you ask them, what else do you do outside of work that you like to do? And they'll look at you blankly, like, what are you talking about? Because it's so all encompassing. And sometimes that's the hardest thing to get them to figure out is, what could you do this weekend that's really renewing for you? That's hard work for them, but that's part of, kind of getting that work-life balance going again. And
I'd like to tag on to something that Jim said too, right? So people who are in leadership roles are stepping up into new leadership roles. They're in the Justle, they're out there looking for that big job. How do these values exercises that we do for the individual, do it for the organization? Do they have values? They probably do. How are they living up to them? And what would it look like to live up to those, right? If value is just to return money to the stockholder, you're going to have a lot of work to do with that organization.
Right. Well, I can't believe it, but we're coming up on time here. I feel like we could talk for a whole other hour or two on this. There's just so much to it.
We need to set some healthy boundaries, right?
So this is not quite quitting. We are being turned off.
Yes. Time to focus on yourselves. So let's do a quick speed round here on for our listeners who are looking for that next thing or are in transition now. And what do you want folks to take away from this conversation? And I'm going to start with you, Allie.
What I've always wanted for people, really, which is about having a healthy sense of who they are and what they're all about, and how the job doesn't define you. It's just one piece of who you are. And so set the limits that you need to set in order to enjoy your life.
Awesome. Thanks, Allie. Jim.
To build on Allie, I think setting boundaries and those limits is critical, and understanding yourself, right? Understanding what's important to you, what do you value, right? Really builds that big picture, so you know where to draw those lines and know where to reinforce them.
Yeah, and we have plenty of coaches that can help you figure that out. Yeah,
that's right.
Ted.
Yeah, it's strange. I started off being the contrarian, but I'm absolutely in agreement with those two things. It's self-awareness. What are your values? What's important to you? What does a fulfilled life and job's part of life, what does that look like? And the more work you do to understand that, the better leader you are.
Awesome. Thanks, Ted. And Karen, bring us home.
I guess I would encourage people to be mindful of the incredible impact that stress can have in your life. And especially for people that are in transition, that's a completely time of uncertainty, and that's highly stressful. So to actually increase your self-care measures to really help to balance out the stress that is there in that type of time frame, and or people that are in jobs that are that they're just dealing with those unrealistic expectations. So self-care.
Great. And Karen, this reminds me of a question I wanted to ask and forgot during the call. Which of the Willenbring twins here is the oldest?
That would be Jim by 4 minutes.
That's
which
awesome.
He always, he never lets me forget.
Nice.
He'll always be older than you, Karen.
I know.
He's gonna get all those
also
milestones right before you do. So that's good.
I twist the knife a little bit that way too.
Your elder brother. Yeah.
Yes.
Are you guys able to communicate telepathically? So there was communication going on that we were not aware of?
All the time.
Were you sharing notes? Yeah.
We don't need notes. It's all right here.
It is. It's just like, it's like right there,
That's right.
All right.
Well,
that's great.
Thank you, everyone, for joining this call. Super important topic. And Karen, welcome to the party. So great to have you in our merry band here, and looking forward to the next one.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ernie. Always great
Thanks, everybody.
Good to see you.
Bye.
Bye.